Hello, and welcome back to the Sleepy Historian. The hour is late. The world outside has grown quiet, and the embers in the hearth are glowing softly. It is the perfect time to let the noise of the present day fade away and listen to the echoes of the past. Tonight, we are traveling back, far back, to a time of mist-shrouded hills, of iron and honor, of tribes and traditions that dance to the rhythm of the earth itself. We are going to the world of the ancient Celts. When we think of a Celtic warrior, our minds often conjure a very specific image. A fierce figure, perhaps with blue woad paint on their skin, a wild look in their eyes, charging into battle with a cry that could curdle the blood. And while that ferocity was certainly a part of their story, it is only one chapter. Did you know that, for all their fearsome reputation, the ancient Celts held a profound and surprising secret to joy? A way of living that was deeply connected, richly textured, and filled with a kind of vibrant happiness that we, in our modern world, often strive for but rarely grasp. It was a joy found not in conquest alone, but in community, in nature, in the power of a well-told story, and in the deep, unshakable belief that this life was but a single step in a much grander journey. So find a comfortable spot. Let your breathing slow. Let the world outside fade away, and join me as we uncover the Celtic warrior's secret to joy. Our journey begins not on the battlefield, but in the heart of the home, the roundhouse. Imagine the air, thick and warm, smelling of wood smoke, roasted meat, and sweet honeyed mead. This is the setting for the great feast, the cumhruinu, the gathering. To the Celts, the feast was not merely about sustenance. It was the very bedrock of their society, the loom upon which the fabric of their community was woven. Here, in the flickering firelight, a warrior was not just a fighter. They were a kinsman, a neighbor, a friend. The joy of the feast was a joy of belonging. Picture the scene. A large, circular building with a high, conical roof thatched with reeds, a central fire pit casting dancing shadows on the wattle and daub walls. People are gathered on benches draped with furs and woven cloths. There is no rigid, silent formality here. The air buzzes with life. Laughter rings out, deep and hearty. Voices rise and fall in animated conversation, sharing news of the harvest, the hunt, or the latest gossip from a neighboring tribe. Clay and wooden cups, constantly refilled with ale or mead, are passed from hand to hand. The chieftain, or Rai, presides, but he is not a distant emperor. He is first among equals, his authority earned through generosity and wisdom as much as through martial prowess. His role is to ensure the feast is plentiful, that the bonds of kinship are strengthened. To host a great feast was a sign of a strong and prosperous leader, and to be a guest was to be part of that strength. The food itself was a source of simple, profound pleasure. A whole pig or calf might be roasting over the fire on a spit, its skin crackling, its aroma filling the entire space. There would be stews bubbling in great cauldrons, filled with grains like barley and spelt, and vegetables pulled from the earth, leeks, onions, and cabbage. There would be flatbreads, cooked on hot stones, and bowls of butter and cheese. This was not just fuel. It was the bounty of the land, a tangible expression of the tribe's connection to the earth and their success in living in harmony with it. But the true magic of the feast, the element that elevated it from a simple meal to a sacred event, was the presence of the bard, the filly. When the bard stood, a hush would fall over the boisterous crowd. With a harp resting on their knee, its strings shimmering in the firelight, they would begin to speak, or to sing. Their words were the tribe's memory, its soul. They sang the great epics. The tales of legendary heroes like Cu Chulainn or Fionn Mac Cumhaill. They recounted the tribe's own history, celebrating the glorious deeds of ancestors and the bravery of the warriors sitting right there in the hall. To hear your name, or the name of your father, woven into the bard's song was the highest honor. It was a confirmation that your life had meaning, that your deeds were worthy of being remembered. This was a powerful source of joy. The joy of recognition, of legacy. The bard's performance was an emotional journey. One moment, the hall would be roaring with laughter at a witty tale. The next, a respectful silence would fall as they sang a lament for a fallen hero. They were masters of emotion, and through their art, they bound the entire community together in a shared experience. In that roundhouse, surrounded by kith and kin, with a full belly and a cup of mead, listening to the timeless stories of his people, the Celtic warrior found a deep and abiding joy. It was the joy of connection to his past, his present, and his people. It was the feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be, a vital thread in a beautiful and enduring tapestry. Now, let us leave the warmth of the roundhouse and step out into the cool, crisp night air. Look up, the stars are a brilliant canopy, undimmed by modern lights. The wind whispers through the leaves of an ancient forest that crowds the edges of the settlement. For the Celtic warrior, the natural world, was not a backdrop. It was not something to be conquered or tamed. It was a living, breathing entity filled with spirits, power, and profound wisdom. Their second secret to joy was this deep, sacred bond with nature and Dalra. The Celtic worldview was fundamentally animistic. They believed that every river, every mountain, every ancient tree possessed its own spirit, its own consciousness. The forest was not just a collection of trees. It was a community of silent, watchful beings. A river was not just a source of water. It was a goddess, a life-giving force that could also be a boundary to the other world. This belief transformed the world from a passive landscape into an active, vibrant, and sacred space. A walk through the woods was a journey through a cathedral. The joy found here was one of reverence and harmony. Certain places were especially sacred. Deep within the forests were clearings known as nemetons, sacred groves. These were their temples. There were no stone walls, no ornate roofs. The sky was their ceiling, and ancient, gnarled oak trees were their pillars. Here, under the sheltering branches, the Druids, the Celtic priests, philosophers, and scientists, would perform their rituals. They would observe the flight of birds, the patterns of the clouds, the rustling of leaves, seeking to understand the will of the gods and the rhythms of the cosmos. For a warrior, to enter a nemeton was to enter a place of profound peace and power. It was a place to leave the concerns of daily life behind, to connect with the timeless forces that governed all things. This connection wasn't just abstract. It was woven into the very fabric of their daily lives and their calendar. Their great festivals were tied to the turning of the seasons. There was Imbolc, celebrating the first stirrings of spring. Beltane, with its great bonfires, celebrating the full bloom of life in early summer. Lugnasad, the celebration of the first harvest. And most famously, Samhain, marking the end of the harvest and the beginning of the darker half of the year. These festivals were moments of immense collective joy. At Beltane, for instance, the tribe would drive their cattle between two large bonfires, believing the smoke would purify and protect them. People would dance, feast, and celebrate the raw, vibrant energy of the earth coming back to life. It was a joy born of participation, of being an active part of the great cycle of death and rebirth. This deep love for nature also manifested in their art. Look closely at Celtic designs. The intricate knotwork, the swirling triskelions, the stylized animals. These are not just abstract patterns. They are artistic expressions of the natural world. The endless, flowing lines of the knotwork represent the eternal, interconnected nature of life. The spirals mimic the unfurling of a fern, the shape of a seashell, or the swirling of water. Their art was a meditation on the patterns they saw all around them, a way of capturing the life force of the world and incorporating it into their daily objects. Their jewelry, their weapons, their sacred stones. For the warrior, this bond with nature was a source of strength and solace. Before a battle, they might draw strength from the steadfastness of an ancient oak. On a long journey, the song of a river could be a comforting companion. The flight of an eagle could be an omen, a message from the gods. They did not see themselves as separate from nature, but as a part of it. And in that belonging, in that deep, respectful relationship with the living world, they found a quiet, powerful, and enduring joy. It was the joy of being home. Of course, we cannot speak of a Celtic warrior without speaking of battle. But to understand the joy they found in it, we must look past the simple act of violence and see the complex web of ideals that lay beneath. The pursuit of glory and honor, and Ghua agus and anwa. For the Celts, a person's life was measured not in years, nor in wealth, but in deeds. A life lived without honor, without brave acts worthy of remembrance, was a life wasted. The ultimate goal was to become a figure of legend, to have your name and your story told by the bards for generations to come. This was their form of immortality, and the pursuit of it was a driving force. This quest for glory began long before the battlefield, often at the feasts we have already visited. A tradition known as the hero's portion, or curedmere, was a central part of this. The finest cut of the roasted meat was reserved for the bravest warrior present. But who was the bravest? This was often decided through a ritual of boasting. Warriors would stand and recount their deeds, the enemies they had slain, the challenges they had overcome. This was not seen as mere arrogance. It was a formal declaration of one's worth, a living resume spoken before the entire tribe. Other warriors could, and often did, challenge these claims, leading to heated debates or even duels. To be awarded the hero's portion was an immense honor, a public recognition of one's courage and skill. The joy here was the thrill of competition, the satisfaction of earned respect. When battle did come, it was seen as the ultimate test of a warrior's character. The Celts, as described by Roman historians like Caesar, often preferred individual combat over disciplined formations. A battle could begin with champions from each side stepping forward to challenge one another. This was high drama. The two armies would watch as their greatest heroes fought, a spectacle of skill, strength, and courage. For the warrior, this was their moment to shine, to perform the deeds that the bards would later turn into song. The joy was in the test itself. The adrenaline, the focus, the feeling of being truly and completely alive in a moment where death was a constant possibility. Their appearance in battle was part of this performance. They would often go into battle with their hair washed in lime, making it stiff and spiky, to appear taller and more terrifying. Some, like the Geeseti, were famous for fighting naked, adorned only with a golden torque around their neck, a display of supreme confidence in their prowess and their belief that fate, not armor, would decide their end. This was not madness. It was a psychological statement. It said, "I have no fear. My skill is my armor, my courage is my shield." To face an enemy with such boldness was an act of supreme self-expression, a source of fierce, ecstatic joy. But honor was not just about aggression. It was also about loyalty to one's chieftain and tribe, about keeping one's oaths, and about generosity. A great warrior was expected to be a great leader, to protect their people, and to share the spoils of victory. The glory was not just personal, it was communal. A hero's victory was the tribe's victory. The joy, then, was not a selfish or bloodthirsty glee. It was the profound satisfaction of living up to a demanding code of conduct, of proving one's worth to the community, and of creating a story that would outlive them. It was the joy of knowing that even if your body fell, your name, your honor, would live forever in the memory of your people. In a society without widespread literacy, where history was not written in books but carried in the mind, the spoken word held an almost supernatural power. This brings us to another, more subtle source of Celtic joy, the power of the word. And focal, the Celts revered language. They understood that words could build and words could destroy. They could inspire armies, heal spirits, and curse enemies. This power was most concentrated in two figures, the bard, whom we have met at the feast, and the druid. The joy associated with the word was the joy of intellect, of wit, of creation, and of understanding the hidden mechanics of the world. Let's look again at the bards, the Fili. Their training was incredibly rigorous, lasting for many years. They had to memorize hundreds, if not thousands, of stories, poems, and genealogies. They were the living libraries of their people. But they were not just reciters, they were creators. The joy of the bard was the joy of the artist. The challenge of finding the perfect word, of crafting a line of poetry so beautiful and powerful that it could move a whole of hardened warriors to tears or laughter. They mastered complex poetic forms, using alliteration, rhyme, and rhythm to create a mesmerizing effect. For the listener, the warrior in the hall, the joy was in being transported by the story, in feeling the shared emotions of the tribe, and in appreciating the sheer skill of the performance. A good bard was a superstar, celebrated and richly rewarded. But the word also had a darker, more feared side. Just as a bard could compose a poem of praise, an ear that would elevate a person's honor, they could also compose a satire, an air. A powerful satire was believed to be a literal curse. It could cause physical blemishes to appear on its target, ruin their reputation, and lead to their social ostracization. The fear of being satirized was a powerful tool for social control, ensuring that even powerful chieftains and warriors adhered to the rules of honor and generosity. The joy here, for the community, was a kind of righteous satisfaction. The power of truth and wit holding unchecked power at bay. Then there were the Druids. They were the keepers of the deepest knowledge: law, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. They were the judges who settled disputes, the advisors to kings, and the intermediaries between the human world and the world of the gods. Their knowledge was considered so sacred that it was forbidden to be written down. It was passed from master to student orally through decades of intense training. The joy of the Druid was the joy of wisdom, of understanding the intricate patterns of the cosmos, the laws that governed society, and the secrets of the soul. For the warrior and the common person, the Druids represented order and meaning in a chaotic world. To seek the counsel of a Druid was to seek clarity. Their pronouncements, their judgments, their teachings provided a framework for life, a sense of cosmic order. The joy they offered was the comfort of understanding, the peace that comes from knowing your place in the grand scheme of things. So, for the Celtic warrior, the spoken word was a constant presence. It was the song that stirred his heart, the story that shaped his identity, the law that guided his actions, and the wisdom that calmed his soul. The joy of the word was the joy of the mind, the thrill of a clever phrase, the beauty of a timeless poem, and the deep satisfaction of shared human understanding. To understand the Celtic mindset, we must grasp a concept that is perhaps most alien to our own: their perception of life and death. The physical world we see was, to them, only half of the story. Running parallel to it, sometimes touching, sometimes overlapping, was the other world, and Saal Isle, and their belief in this realm was the key to a unique and profound form of joy. The other world was not a distant heaven or a fiery hell to be reached only after death. It was a tangible, though mystical place. It was the realm of the gods, the ancestors, and the Fey folk, the Tuatha De Danann. It was often described as a land of eternal youth and beauty, where there was no sickness or old age, and where 100 years could pass like a single day. Crucially, the Celts believed that the veil between our world and the other world was thin. In certain places, like ancient burial mounds or caves, and at certain times, one could cross over. The most significant of these times was the festival of Samhain, which we now know as Halloween. Samhain marked the end of the year and the beginning of winter. For the Celts, it was a time of immense supernatural power. The veil between the worlds dissolved, and spirits, both benevolent and malevolent, could walk freely among mortals. This might sound terrifying, but for the Celts, it was a time of great importance and even celebration. It was a time to honor the ancestors. Feasts were held, and a place was set at the table for the spirits of the dead, who were believed to return to their homes for one night. This was not a somber occasion, but a reunion. It reinforced the idea that death was not an end, but a transition. The people you loved were not gone forever. They were simply in another room, and on this night, the door was open. This belief had a profound effect on the Celtic warriors' approach to life. The Roman observers were often stunned by the Celts' seeming fearlessness in battle. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus wrote that they despised death to such a degree that they enter battle without protective armor. This wasn't because they were suicidal. It was because they held a deep conviction, taught by the Druids, that the soul was immortal. They believed in reincarnation or the transmigration of the soul. When they died, their spirit would simply move on. Perhaps to the other world for a time, perhaps to be reborn into a new body. This belief stripped death of its finality, of its ultimate terror. If death is not an end, then life can be lived with more passion, more courage, more intensity. The fear that holds so many of us back, the fear of oblivion, was simply not a major part of their worldview. The joy that stemmed from this was a joy of liberation. It was the freedom to take risks, to live for honor rather than for mere survival. It was the comfort of knowing that the bonds of kinship and love were not severed by death. And it was a sense of being part of an eternal, cosmic story, a grand cycle of existence that stretched far beyond the confines of a single, short life. This perspective infused their world with a sense of magic and wonder. A strange mist rolling in from the hills, a sudden encounter with a white stag in the forest. These were not random occurrences. They could be signs, messages from the otherworld, a reminder that the world was far more mysterious and magical than it appeared on the surface. To live in such a world is to be open to constant wonder, and that openness, that sense of an enchanted reality, was a deep and abiding source of joy. Finally, we come to a quality that is perhaps the most defining characteristic of the Celtic peoples, both ancient and modern: a fierce and unyielding love of freedom. And T-Sersha, the world of the Celts was not one of vast, centralized empires like Rome. It was a mosaic of hundreds of individual tribes, or tuatha. Each tribe was a self-governing entity with its own king, its own laws, and its own territory. While they shared a common culture, language, and religion, they were politically fragmented and fiercely independent. This political structure fostered a deep-seated value for personal and tribal freedom. The Celtic warrior was not a faceless cog in a vast military machine. He was an individual fighting for his own honor, his own family, and his own small kingdom. His loyalty was given not to a distant, abstract emperor, but to a chieftain he knew personally, one with whom he feasted and hunted. This created a powerful sense of agency and importance. Roman writers, accustomed to their own rigid hierarchy, were often baffled by this. They described the Celts as proud, boastful, and difficult to command. What they were seeing was a culture that prized individual will and expression. To be a free person, able to speak your mind, to choose your own path within the bounds of the tribe's laws, was the natural state of being. The alternative, submission to an outside power, was considered the ultimate shame. This is why they resisted the Roman legions so fiercely for so long. For a Celtic warrior, fighting against Rome was not just a territorial dispute. It was an existential battle for their very way of life. They were fighting for the right to be themselves, to worship their own gods, to be ruled by their own leaders, and to live by their own code of honor. The famous speech attributed to the Caledonian chieftain Calgacus before his final battle with the Romans captures this spirit perfectly. He described the Romans as those who create a desert and call it peace. For him, and for his warriors, a life of subjugated comfort was no life at all. Better to die on your feet than live on your knees. The joy of freedom, then, was the very air they breathed. It was the joy of self-determination. It was the pride a warrior felt looking out over the lands of his ancestors, knowing they were his to protect. It was the freedom to gallop on horseback, across windswept, open country, with no walls or foreign patrols to hinder his way. It was the freedom to gather in the roundhouse and speak his mind, to challenge his peers, and to strive for glory on his own terms. This love of freedom was not an easy path. It led to constant intertribal warfare and made them vulnerable to more unified forces like Rome. But it was essential to their identity. It was the fire in their spirit, the core of their being. The joy it provided was not the gentle comfort of security, but the exhilarating and sometimes dangerous thrill of being the master of one's own destiny. So, what was the Celtic warrior's secret to joy? As the fire burns low and our story comes to a close, we can see that it was not one secret, but many. It was a rich and interwoven tapestry. It was the warmth of community in the feasting hall, the taste of mead, and the sound of a well-told story. It was the sacred hush of an ancient forest, the feeling of kinship with the living earth. It was the thrill of a life lived for honor, the pursuit of a glory that would echo through time. It was the power of a perfectly crafted poem and the comfort of a deep, cosmic wisdom. It was the liberation that comes from seeing death not as an end, but as a doorway. And it was the fierce, unshakable pride of a free spirit. It was, in the end, a joy that came from living a life that was full of connection, full of meaning, full of passion, and full of purpose. A life worthy of a song. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. I hope it has given you a moment of peace and reflection. May your own life be filled with joy in all its many forms. Sleep well.